Alors on comprend bien que la
So,
stratégie climat ne peut pas être
we
un simple
understand
plan
that climate
d'intention. Ça, on l'a vu
strategy cannot be
dans
a
une
simple plan
précédente
of
session.
intent.
Elle repose sur des données
As we've
robustes, des
seen, it
décisions à long
relies
terme,
on
une
robust
capacité à
data,
embarquer les acteurs.
long-term decisions, and the
Adapter les
ability to get
villes, eh ben, ça
stakeholders
coûte.
on board.
Mais ne rien faire, finalement, ça coûte
Cities
encore plus. Et ça,
adaptation
c'est largement
does
démontré. Et on va en
cost,
poser les
and
éléments tout à
not
l'heure.
doing anything
Et pour
costs
nous aider
even
à
more.
poser les termes du débat économique, nous accueillons Vincent Viguié,
So,
économiste au
we
CIRED,
have Vincent
spécialiste de
VIGUIÉ,
l'évaluation des politiques
who
d'adaptation en
is
milieu urbain. Je vous
an
demande
economist at
d'accueillir,
CIRED
comme il se doit,
specializing in the
Vincent Viguié.
evaluation of adaptation policies in urban environments. Please, to set us the terms of the economic debate.
Ok.
On y va, Vincent, parce que nous sommes diffusés en direct. Il y a des centaines de personnes qui nous suivent en direct.
Pas de souci. Bonjour à tous et merci beaucoup pour cette invitation. Alors, j'aimerais commencer cette présentation en rappelant simplement le fait que globalement, à travers le monde, lorsqu'on regarde à travers les différents pays, il y a vraiment un décalage flagrant entre les constats scientifiques et ce qui est fait en général pour l'adaptation. C'est par exemple ce qui est évalué chaque année depuis 2021 par des rapports des Nations Unies. Ici, par exemple, vous voyez le titre du dernier rapport paru en novembre 2024 qui évalue l'action des États dans le monde en matière d'adaptation. Et le mot d'introduction de ce rapport, c'est ce qui est marqué ici, c'est que à mesure que les impacts du climat s'intensifient, l'adaptation faite en général partout dans le monde continue d'être loin derrière ce qui pourrait être fait. Les progrès dans l'implémentation sont lents et sont remplis de problèmes. Ça, c'est ce qu'on observe au niveau des États.
This is what we see among the states, and when we look at a closer look, we can do the same thing. The things are heading in the right direction, but too slowly, and maybe too slowly when we look at the problem. And when we look at the cities, and we have studies to try to assess how the adaptation plans are meeting some criteria and requirements. So we have the survey from 2023, and what we can see is that on this graph, each point represents a different city in Europe, and you can see on the map on the right-hand side, and you can see on the y-axis we have some quality index, and on the x-axis you have the years. So you can see that in years, when we have plans and more recent plans, they are of better quality, and we try to assess more impacts, and they have better criteria and better indicators. And we see that the score is still low. And one of the important questions we have today during this seminar is why? Why are we lagging behind compared to what we could do if we could adapt our cities to climate change? And we have a lot of documents, and we have summaries. Everything has been summarized in the IPCC chapter. And if you look at the chapter 17 of this report, with the list of all the barriers and hurdles while we're developing adaptation plans, we identified 4 different factors. So to give you some explanation and to tell you what we have to do to create these adaptation plans. First of all, it has to do with money, financial resources available for adaptation, and secondly, the knowledge we have and the available knowledge. Thirdly, the adapted governance, and fourthly, what we call the catalytic conditions. Everything related to culture and how we can convince people so they can adapt adequately. It was not the least important factor, because I just put it at the end. But what I wanted to tell you during this presentation, I want to go more into details to tell you more about these requirements. And I would like to tell you how these points are interdependent. And obviously we have to talk about finance, and we need to tell you how finance and funding depends so so much on all the 2 points. All right, I give you some figures. When we talk about funding adaptation, we don't have the choice between funding adaptation actions or not doing anything at all. We don't have the choice between spending money or not spending money. The question is how we can have adaptation strategies, or we can suffer the impacts. And anyway, when we have choice, we need to make adaptation plans. And obviously, practically speaking, we need to strike the right balance between both. We look at examples from France, and we have data from France Assurance, a group of insuring companies, and you see that the costs are fluctuating heavily from one year to another, but we see that it's increasing. If you look at 23, 24, it's way above threshold of 4 billion euros, and you see that every year, globally, we lose approximately 5 billion euros because of climate change, and it's rising. So if we look at the future, I'll just give you some information from a PhD students of mine, and we try to summarize all the costs generated by climate change in France, and we can see on the left-hand side, we have different hypothesis based on a forecast of the GDP. We have different studies, but the losses could be estimated around a few percent of the GDP, and we know that the GDP now is approximately 3,000 billion euros, and you see 1% of 3,000 billion euros, it's a lot of money. And furthermore, when you look at the studies, we have all the studies and bigger studies and more recent studies, and we can see that 1 point represents one study. And it's not the date of the impacts, but the date of the publication. And you see that the more modern, more recent the studies are, and the more important the impact is.
Alors, face à ça, lorsqu'on s'intéresse au coût de l'adaptation, au coût, en tout cas aux besoins de financement public de l'adaptation, qui est juste une partie du coût, bon, c'est pas forcément évident d'avoir des chiffres sur le coût des financements publics de l'adaptation.
It's very difficult to have a good estimate of the costs. And we have 2 reports recently published by E4C, the Institute for Climate. I'm not sure the authors are with us today, but I would like to I will use these reports during my presentation, and based on these reports for 2022, the funding costs for most urgent measures, regardless of the choices we'll make, and the estimates represent approximately 2 billion euros per year. And on the right-hand side, we have measures that will go a bit further, and so we can adapt the country in a very precise way, in a very adequate way. We worked on construction, transport, and we have an estimate on approximately 5 to 20 billion euros. But it's very difficult to forecast the costs, but when you look at this, the funding costs are pretty much similar or even lower compared to the impacts of climate change we're experiencing even today. So it's important when we talk about funding adaptation, and we need to look at the funding needs are quite low compared to the impacts we're currently facing now and we will face in the future. Another point, as I told you, that we have different factors, different indicators. First of all, we had funding, education, governance. But when we look at the report on the left-hand side, among the measures which will be implemented now. We have one measure which only costs 250 million euros, which is quite low compared to the overall budget of France and compared to the real needs for adaptation. And this 250 million euros is related to the cost of the cost of research, how we can acquire more knowledge, how we can get the necessary expertise, and how we can actually spread the knowledge of this. And I would like to talk a bit more about this.
Au changement climatique, ça requiert de l'expertise, ça requiert de la recherche et ça requiert des moyens.
Adaptation requires needs and resources and human resources, and the costs are not that high compared to other accounts, but it's crucial. I'll just give you a short example, like 2 examples of potential consequences based on the data we have. So for example, here we have a photo taken a few years ago after heavy rainfalls, and we have a landslide, and we no longer have passengers in the wagon. But actually what you need to see in the picture that among these potential impacts of climate change that can be very important, and it has some significant consequences in what we call the critical infrastructure, creating a mesh in the country. So, for example, telecommunication, transport, electricity, and we have huge vulnerabilities in France, like pretty much all the countries. And now, in France, we will need much more data so we can adapt our networks. So France's strategy worked on this in 2022. Still can improve what we do, but another example to show how much we need the knowledge. Tackling climate change is a bit different than tackling the natural disasters, because of climate change we see an increase in the risks of natural disasters. It's quite different to adapt to potential heat waves or to a heat wave happening after 6 months of drought, or facing heat waves in a city with a lot of climatic refugees. So the thing is, climate change doesn't increase potential risks separately, but increase all the risks at the same time. So the recurring crisis, the repeating crisis, and simultaneous crisis is a risk. And on this map, you have a summary of all the potential risks in France, and you see that they are very different. So, moving on to the third point, governance. What we can see when we need funds for climate change adaptation, we see that the available funds depend a lot on the actions we want to implement. And based on the choices we make, it may lead to different needs in terms of funds. So if we look at transport, if, for example, we have roads that are flooded because they are located in areas who may be flooded more frequently in the future, we can actually make sure that this road will not be flooded anymore. But if we want to create dams and we accept that sometimes it may be flooded a few days per year, so see, it's not that expensive. So it's all about choices. How we can guarantee a safety level pretty much similar to what we have now. It may be very expensive, but if we try to leave some areas that may be flooded, for example, it can be done at a lower cost. So if they get flooded or they experience natural disasters, of course, the insurers will have to compensate, and it may lead to some impact on houses. So for example, if we are located near a power plant, a nuclear power plant, we may have some very stringent measures. But in other places, we may actually accept that it could be flooded a few days per year. So it really, the adaptation cost depends a lot on what we really ready to give up on and what we want to accept. Do we accept that a few things may depend on climate change? Let's move on to Paris, for example, and the roofs of Paris, and consider it to be an essential part of the identity of the country. But the problem is, most of them are made in zinc, and they're not ideal when you have heat waves. And this is where a lot of people actually die or faint when they are living on the final at the top of the buildings. So maybe we have measures, we have better isolation, and we can actually have fresher homes. So we paint the roofs in white, like in New York? Or do you want to preserve the identity of the country? Well, in that case, we need to accept that the final floor of the upper floors of buildings may not be livable. Or do we pay them more to compensate the loss of value of the upper floors? So there's no real choice. There's not a good answer. So we have choices we need to make. This has to do with is a democratic choice. So there was a lot of debate and discussions on how to adapt our cities. There's, for example, the ski resorts in the mountains, and we know that snow is melting, is disappearing from these mountains. How can we support these ski resorts and the ski resorts, and how could we support them? Who has to pay? Who has to pay to when we have to relocate people because we're building a dam? Who has to pay for this? There's no good answer. It's just a choice we have to make, and based on the choices, well, the costs for the government, for the local authority will be different. And the mistake would be not to ask the question, because if we don't ask ourselves this question, if we choose one adaptation path, we have winners and losers. But if we don't give the choice to anyone to take a decision, it's a mistake. Okay. And finally, my last point, as I said previously, when we look at the adaptation costs, but it's quite similar to what we saw in other countries. Based on the Climate Change Committee, it represents approximately 10 billion euros per year to adapt the country. So they're quite high in absolute values, but when you compare it to the investments we do every year, it's quite slow. And when we look at, as Mrs. Simio said, it has to do with anticipation. So, I'll give you an example. We are building new houses, and we need to comply with thermal regulations from 2020. We call the summer comfort, and it's based on the heat waves we saw in Paris, and more stakeholders started to say that the heat wave in 2023 was severe, but it will be not as extreme as the heat waves we'll see in the coming years. So this is the buildings we are constructing right now are not adapted to the coming heat waves of the future. So it has an impact, and these additional costs should be included in what we do. And if we don't anticipate enough and well enough, we'll have to rebuild them. And it would be even more expensive. So my final message would be that adaptation, what is adaptation? Well, it's just the idea of anticipating the future, to think about the future of our regions. In the future, while understanding the natural disasters, climate change, and understanding the constraints to reduce the CO2 emissions and greenhouse gases. Adaptation is all about developing these territories by complying with these constraints and not ignoring what's happening. And that's what is written in the IPCC report. And we have a comparison between the potential evolution of our territories. And it shows and what is important for an area to be adaptive is to understand what's at stake and how we can work for the inhabitants. Okay. The conclusion is that no one really knows what's going to happen in the future. It's much more difficult to anticipate, but what we are sure about is that we still have the choice to choose our trajectory. And secondly, to adapt is to understand and to anticipate and to imagine the future of our territories. It's pretty much the same thing as adapting while considering the various stakes and, for example, biodiversity. And it's important to have experts and data. It's important to consider all this. And the more we can anticipate and the lowest the cost will be. And finally, the fact that adaptation is all about making choices. Locally, nationally, we have winners and losers. And we can actually compensate the losers, and we can make sure that everything happens smoothly. But while we are developing an adaptation strategy, how can we do to attract the losers? How can we make sure that people who maybe on the losing end can accept to participate in our debates and discussions? But one answer is that when we have objective numbers, we have modeling tools, so we can understand the potential consequences of our choices. It may lead to have a quiet and peaceful debates, and it may be linked to the needs of expertise and financial resources.
Est-ce qu'il y a une question? On va prendre une question.
We'll just take one question. I do have one question, but maybe you have a question. Maybe online you have a question. Just a short reminder. We would like to remind you that you have a superpower. You can use the hashtag FIMC 2025, and your second superpower is that you can participate in this discussion with online or from here. And in this room, in the salle des fêtes of the municipality, do you have a question? Yes. I won't ask my question. But I can ask my question too. My name is Erwan Leca, and I'm a student and I'm studying environmental rights. I would like to thank you very much for your presentation. I thought it was absolutely amazing. What could lead people to have a discussion in common? What would be the tools you would consider and you would suggest to have these discussions and this conversation? Well, it's pretty much the question I had, and the question I had about can we have a peaceful discussion about with all these indicators. Well, it's a very complex question. I'm not an expert of these conversations, but what I've read and what I've heard about is that to bring everyone around the table, one of the many solutions is that we have studies and pilot studies and pilot regions when we have stakeholders and decision makers are fully committed. So some people want to act more than in other regions. And this is how we can bring people around the table. So you have discussions, conversations on adaptation, and it may be good examples for other regions. I don't know if it's a solution to everything, but it's one of the options as implemented by NGOs and associations. Thank you. Thank you very much, Vincent VIGUIÉ. Give him a round of applause. And it was brilliant. I agree with you, everyone.